covers the life and death of the other mayor, Tomás MacCurtain, who in March 1920 was shot dead in his home in the city.
100 years ago, Cork became the focus of world attention when its Lord Mayor and first citizen was murdered at his home in the city's Blackpool area. Tomás MacCurtain's successor, Terence McSweeney, would also die after a prolonged hunger strike in Brixton Prison. Tomás MacCurtain was the first Sinn Féin Mayor of Cork. This evening we'll be looking at the circumstances of his death, but also at the life and times of this IRA commander, businessman, musician and politician. In 1920, Cork was one of the most prosperous cities of the British Empire. However, as opposition to British rule intensified, it was also one of the most violent. One of the most influential figures in this movement was Tomás MacCurtain, a businessman from the Blackpool area of the city. In 1920, he was the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork and the first Catholic one, a popular political figure and an IRA commander. Tomás MacCurtain was born in the village of Mournabbey between Cork and Mallow, where his parents were small farmers. He was educated locally and later at North Monastery in Cork City. The Irish language was always a strong influence on him. Indeed, his maternal grandmother had been a head school teacher. When he went to school at North Mon, as it's known locally, his love of the language and music further developed. It was here that he also became interested in politics and Irish nationalism. It was that combination of interests that came to the fore when he left school and began teaching Irish and music locally, all the time immersing himself in the independence struggle. MacCurtain married Eilish Walsh, a Cork woman who strongly shared his idealism. Although Cork wasn't a part of the 1916 Rising, MacCurtain and others were more than prepared to play their part in the future struggle for independence. An inevitable result of that commitment was a movement into local politics. He was imprisoned in Britain for a time in 1917, and in 1920, Sinn Féin identified him as the preferred candidate for mayor. Only a short time beforehand, he'd been elected to Cork Corporation to represent the Blackpool area. Tomás MacCurtain's portrait hangs today in the office of Cork's Lord Mayor. For his granddaughter, it's an important acknowledgement of his life's work and commitment to Irish independence. What goes through your mind when you see the image?
I'm just very proud to be his granddaughter and just think he looks such a young man.
And what sort of man was he?
It's very hard to believe he'd achieved so much at the age of 36. He was a poet, a writer, a musician. He spoke and taught the Irish language. He was a family man. He ran a number of shops with his brother Sean, and yet he had time to dedicate himself to the freedom of Ireland. So he was a very rounded person, and he actually achieved so much for a man that was only 36 years of age. Then on the activist front, I mean, he was sent into exile, he was in jail. My grandmother had to keep the home fires burning, and that was something both my grandfather and my father always stated, that there wasn't enough credit given to the women of the time in Cork, but especially to my grandmother. They were a very united couple with the same dream.
University College Cork historian John Borgonovo has written extensively about MacCurtain and Munster during the revolutionary period.
Tomás MacCurtain was quite popular across the political divide. He was really charismatic. He was very friendly. MacCurtain was both a military and a political leader. He had been counseling some degree of patience, although he had approved attacks on the RIC prior to this. So he wasn't a pacifist by any means. Cork was one of the best organized portions of the country in terms of the Republican movement, and including both the political and the military wings, and coming along as well. And it also was the first place where real shooting started taking place in early 1920. So it was at the forefront of violent resistance to the British state, but Cork also saw widespread state violence as well.
Tomás MacCurtain was the military strategist who pressed the IRA's advantage in guerrilla warfare. As members of the RIC were increasingly targeted, so too would he and other IRA figures be. They would also mark him out as a target for the security forces, who monitored his activities constantly. Without warning, a large group of them arrived at his home on March 20th, the night of his 36th birthday, and shot him.
Numerous police were involved from at least one, probably more than one police station. Anywhere between 10 and 20 and 30 were part of the whole process. They were seen leaving the station. There were numerous witnesses who recognized police constables disguised surrounding the MacCurtain household. In terms of the event itself, it was pretty brutal. Guys came in disguised. They had coal dust on their face. They knocked on the door. They rushed upstairs. They kind of knocked over MacCurtain's wife, Eilish. They ran into the room, shot him in front of his baby. It was pretty brutal. Again, it really shocked the people of Cork.
Any soldier expects to die in uniform, especially when it's a war situation. But to be shot in your nightgown in front of your wife and children, and you know, it was a deliberate plan. My grandmother's last words to my grandfather were, "Remember, it's for Ireland." I mean, what more can you say that you're prepared for your husband to die, and she would be prepared to die for the cause, and they had that love between them of country, God and family. My dad vividly remembered the soldiers coming up the stairs, shooting him. He was watching through the keyhole. He rushed out, this is in short, and held his father, and they spoke for the hour and a half until he actually passed away. And that was ingrained into my father's memory.
It was a pretty major reprisal for Republican violence in a way that hadn't taken place before. The response was overwhelming in terms of the international press coverage of the inquest, and in terms of the funeral, it was remarkable. About 15,000 people marched in the procession. It took about 2 hours for the cortege to pass any one place. About 100,000 people attended the funeral in a city that had a population of about 75,000. So it was a landmark event in terms of the War of Independence.
Daddy used to always say to us, now mindful of the fact that he wasn't yet 5, that when they came out of the North Cathedral after the Mass, that he walked behind the coffin. There were 2 hearses, one with flowers, one with the body, and then there were obviously all the martyrs, and my grandmother was in a car with the women because she was pregnant and the women didn't walk. And he said he walked behind it out to the St. Bar Cemetery. And we were a bit like, yeah, Dad, sure, you know, we did that. And he said, oh no, I walked on my own and I didn't catch anyone's hand. And he said, when we got to the graveside, I was sitting on my mum's knee, but when they were putting the coffin into the ground, I went over to stand with the men and see the coffin going in. And we just thought it was a bit of hearsay, and we really didn't believe him. But after my dad's death, the Semicolon came to life in the museum, and you see the little boy in a little pantaloon set, walking on his own, and then you see him at Finbar's going off his mum's knee and going over and following the coffin into the ground.
While Cork had seen its share of violence up to that point, MacCurtain's murder was nevertheless both shocking and surprising, given his position as an elected mayor of Cork, and the fact that the police were held responsible for his death.
So during the inquest, the evidence pointed towards a senior member of the RIC being involved in helping to plan this or authorize it, and that was District Inspector Oswald Swansea, who came from Lisburn. And following the assassination, he was transferred out of the city for his own protection. And a few months later, in August 1920, he was assassinated by a couple of members of the Cork IRA, assisted by members of the Belfast IRA. Before leaving Cork for Lisburn, 2 Cork City volunteers were given Tomás MacCurtain's revolver, which had a police permit from a couple other IRA guys, which had actually been signed by Swansea, which gave way to a quip that Swansea had signed his own death warrant. Following his assassination in his native town of Lisburn, there was basically a backlash against the local Catholic population. They were burned out of their houses. There was pronounced anti-Catholic violence that took place over 2 or 3 days, and it really started triggering similar types of sectarian violence in Belfast and elsewhere. So this is really when you start to see the North starting to convulse and kind of this Ulster sectarian violence really convulsing.
If I can just ask you about the effect of the assassination on your grandfather's family, your grandmother was left in very difficult circumstances afterwards.
Yes, and she also had still to bring up a young family. She financially, it was going to be a huge burden. It was huge sorrow. She was very unwell afterwards because she was expecting twin girls who were stillborn. They were born in the end of June, the start of July, and so she had to bury them back out to Finbar Cemetery again, past the Republican plot where her husband was, and bury her 2 babies. My grandmother always said that the night that her husband was murdered, that actually her 2 babies were murdered as well.
There was such a tremendous backlash following the assassination of Tomás MacCurtain that many of the Crown forces realized that would be an own goal if they did that it would be counterproductive for them to carry out a similar type of assassination against senior political officials, whether that's Arthur Griffith or Eamon Devereux. But it didn't prevent